Well, welcome back to History and Politics Chat. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. Um, Let me start. I'm going to get to a lot of your questions, which are all over the map, but I want to start with something that you didn't ask about, although I think it's pretty obviously there, and that is that everybody is feeling overwhelmed, and like there's just too much to keep track of, and this is happening here, and this is happening here, and all these things are going on, and it's really important, I think, in a time like this, which is not that feeling overwhelmed, being overwhelmed is not unprecedented. Our particular moment is unprecedented, but to take a deep breath and instead of reacting to what's happening over here with guns and what's happening over here with abortion and what's happening over here with the Supreme Court and what's happening over here with the election of 2024, who knows? And we're way off. That's way out from here. To say, what do I want? What do I want this country to look like? And to stop using the definitions that Republicans are using to hem us in. I mean, at this point, at least I look around in America and I say, there's a lot of things that are not working for me. And I want to work inside the parameters of our governmental system and our Constitution to fix those things. And I'm going to stop worrying about the way that, Alex Jones is talking about it and recognize that he has a problem to be dealt with, but he does not have control over the way I manage what I'm doing. And we've all been in situations like this where you're in a toxic situation, you need to get out, and rather than trying to fight in the toxic situation, you say, I got to deal with that, but here's my plan for moving forward. So let me tell you some of the stuff, the answers to some of the stuff that you have asked, always with that context. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might get out of the moment that we're in. So let me start with your questions here. Oops, wait a minute, that's the wrong file. Let's try this file. Nope, that's not it either. That's the new book. Here we go. So just to get through some of the questions, the specific questions you asked to start with. A lot of people are asking about what exactly the current day Republicans mean when they talk about states' rights and what does that mean for the country. Now, I really have to emphasize again that the current day Republican Party is even a more extreme version of, has an even more extreme version of the ideology that the Southern Democrats had before the Civil War when they talked about states' rights. And what they're trying to do today is to, as I've said before and written at great length, get rid of the power of the federal government that since 1933 has regulated business, provided a basic social safety net, protected civil rights, and promoted infrastructure. That federal government that overruled the states weakened the power of a few generally well-off white men in the states to run everything the way they wanted to. So, for example, the FDR in the 1930s and into the 1940s used the federal government to regulate business and to provide a social safety net to protect workers, for example, who were disabled at the job, and to make sure that the employers had to pay in something to protect those workers. A lot of people at the state level don't like that. A lot of people, I'm sorry, not even at the state level, a lot of business people don't like that. They really want to have the ability to do whatever they want. And so, for example, I said, and got some pushback the other day when I said the people that Mitch McConnell represents, and the wealthy people he represents, and people said, oh, he represents the poorest people in the country. Mitch McConnell does not represent Kentucky. Mitch McConnell is elected from Kentucky, but he is representing the wealthiest Americans, and they would like to get rid of business regulation. Similarly, they don't want to have public infrastructure because it costs tax dollars, and they would prefer to privatize the valuable parts of that and ignore the parts that are not valuable, the same way they did in the 1920s. And they want to get rid of a basic social safety net because that costs money and because it creates a different kind of country than they are perhaps interested in. And finally, of course, there are both wealthy people and religious conservatives and racists and sexists who want to get rid of the federal government's protection of civil rights, which has taken place at the federal government level since the 1950s under Republicans as well as under Democrats. So that idea of a government that does those things, essentially as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, has been embraced by members of both parties since World War II. And we are right now at this crucial phase of dismantling it. And that's been going on really since the Reagan Revolution in 1981, in which, as Tom Hartman pointed out so well recently in a Twitter thread, Reagan promised to people who didn't want to share power with, for example, minorities and women, that he could usher in a better era by slashing the federal government. And what we've gotten instead is huge amounts of our money redistributed up to the very wealthy. We've got a slashing of education. We've got all the pieces that put together a social compact being disintegrated until finally last week the Supreme Court came out. 6 members of the Supreme Court came out and overturned Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision. And what that did was it was a real spanner in the works for the federal government's protection of civil rights. And there are a number of cases now that are also going to be on the table. But of course, that meant that the Supreme Court refuses to recognize a constitutional right that has been in place for 50 years. And of course, that affects not just women, but the entire country. They're saying, you're out of luck on this one. And that, of course, was only a precursor to the West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency decision, which took on the regulatory state. And it really was an attempt to destroy the ability of the government to rein in business, in this case, the fossil fuel industry, but that's not the only business that's going to suddenly get its wings and be able to do whatever it wants. And then, of course, what the Supreme Court said is it is now going to take on the independent state legislature doctrine, which is completely bananas. It is a misreading of the Constitution. I mean, and when I say misreading, this is not interpretation. They literally cut one sentence in half. And what that doctrine means is that, or what it purports to mean is that state legislatures, without interference, even by state courts or state constitutions, can decide to put forward whatever electors they want for the presidency, regardless of how the people in the state vote, regardless of anything else. And that, of course, is completely counter to anything that the framers of the Constitution would have wanted. And that's something that the 4 members of the Supreme Court have signaled they would be willing to consider. And it is something that has people like Judge Michael Ludig, who is a conservative lawyer and a very well-regarded conservative lawyer, everybody from him through Larry Tribe, who is a very well-regarded constitutional lawyer, emeritus from Harvard, who tends to side on the left, saying this is the end of democracy if they do that. So what they are trying to do is to dismantle the power of the federal government in order, and this is the piece people seem to forget, in order to give power to a very few people who will have all the money and who will run our lives for the rest of us. And so when they're talking about states' rights, that's what they're talking about. And I can tell you the history of how we got the concept of states' rights because I'm a 19th century historian primarily, but that gives you enough to go forward right now. So there's a couple of pieces that I want to put together with that. One of the reasons that people like me have our hair on fire over everything that's happening is because in addition to this attempt to push power back to the states, where it will be very easy for a few people to dominate those states and thereby to dominate the federal government through, for example, having control of the Senate and having control of the presidency and the Supreme Court. One of the things that we see is the rise of fascism, or Christo-fascism, as it's being called in its current incarnation in America, which is the attempt to create a government that is a theocracy, but it's a theocracy that works with business. And I just want to point out here that one of the absolute huge red flags that I feel like is not getting enough attention is the conversation in a certain number of states to stop the ability of women from crossing state lines. Now, of course, the federal government would say you can't do that. You can't say, we can't, you're going to restrict somebody's ability to cross state lines. But one of the things that fascist scholars of fascism, not fascist scholars, scholars of fascism look for is, first of all, raising politicians who raise fear over immigrants, people coming in, and there you can see, for example, Putin or Orban, and certainly Donald Trump. So you get a population to back you by saying, oh, we don't want those people to come in. But that's how you rise to fascism, when you cease to let people out, when you can't get past a border. That is a huge deal. That's like, I mean, it's a huge red flag. So one of the reasons that people like me was horrified last week, not only from the overturning of Roe v. Wade and from West Virginia versus um, the Environmental Protection Agency, and this discussion of taking on the independent state legislature doctrine, is because they were also talking about not letting women leave the states. And that is just, again, aside from everything else, that is a huge red flag. So that's one of the things we're watching. Now I'm going to come back to that, but let me go ahead and deal with some of your actual questions. People have asked me what was going on with Representative Liz Cheney from Wyoming, the recent comment she made about people killing babies after they were born. And the answer to that is sort of interesting and complicated. She is fervently anti-abortion. And the argument that anti-abortion activists have made about killing babies after they're born, what most people, including me, say is that that's called murder, and we have laws against that already. But what they are arguing is that on occasion, after an abortion procedure, usually a late-term abortion procedure because of a fetal abnormality or for the life of the mother, really rarely a baby will be born still breathing. And in that case, according to what I've read, I am not a doctor, in that case, and this is all publicly available information, doctors tend to give comfort care to the very young fetus, but the babies expire. And they are making the case that these babies, these very young breathing babies should have intervention to keep them alive. The same way that you could perhaps try and keep a miscarriage alive. And the argument they're making is that this is a pro-life stance, but there is a larger political project behind that, and that is, of course, that this is extraordinarily inflammatory for their base. And so one of the real problems that pro-choice people have with it is that it's really ill-defined. And what they say, I think accurately, is that these attempted laws are, or these proposed laws are attempts to terrify women's healthcare providers into refusing to manage abortions at all, because they're afraid they're going to get hit one way or another for not doing the right thing, or doing the right thing, or any number of different places, because the rules as they have been written, or the laws that they have been proposed, are really vague about how one is supposed to intervene and what they're supposed to do. So I think probably many people have in their minds, when they hear post-birth or whatever it was, abortion, that somebody's out there murdering, the people in the nursery, in the hospital. But this is actually part of the medical procedure. And so that's, I think, what she's talking about. It's a little weird, simply because obviously once somebody's alive and you kill them, that's murder. So we already have laws against that. And so when you asked about it, I thought, well, that's really weird. I don't really know. So I went and looked it up, and that's what I found out. All right. So a lot of people have asked about, I'm going to put that later. So one of the things that people have asked a lot about is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, as you know, has gone rogue. It is acting in a number of ways that are radical and very alarming. So, for example, the courts have always focused on trying to preserve continuity in the law. They try not to overturn the apple cart, because for many reasons. I mean, it hurts the economy to not know what's going to happen next. It hurts stability. The last thing you want is to have the laws swing back and forth really quickly. That's usually a sign of, a junta, or of a really destabilized country. So the courts tend to try to tweak the law a little bit, but not to overturn it. And this court, of course, has just thrown all that out the window and is doing whatever the heck it wants, not only in the cases that I just mentioned, but in terms of indigenous control over their lands, in terms of Miranda rights, in terms of the ability for convicted murderers to introduce new material to overturn uh, death sentences. They've really just said we're ripping it all up and we're doing it our own way, and that is itself deeply problematic. Um, when in fact the courts have done something dramatic like they did in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which did completely reverse Plessy v. Ferguson, which was an 1896 court decision saying that, yeah, segregation, go for it. And Brown versus Board said, no, not in the public schools. It didn't overturn everything all at once. It started in the public schools. The lawmakers were out there really trying to help bring the country along with that. They weren't just saying, yeah, we're just going to go for this. They really were trying to move the country into a new position. This court isn't doing it. They're just tearing stuff up. And so that is deeply problematic on its face. It is also deeply problematic that what they are doing is destroying the fabric of the law under which we have lived for almost 100 years. They are dismantling the modern American state and its protection of civil rights, its protection of the environment, its regulation of business, its protection of a social safety net. All of that is on the table. So what does one do about that? Well, first of all, get rid of the language that says we want to pack the court, because that's what's already been done. The radical right has, in fact, packed this court, and it's not normal. So every time anybody talks about fixing the Supreme Court, people like Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell get out and say, oh, they're being so radical. But no, that's really quite like, setting a building on fire and then saying that the fire department, when it comes to try and put the fire out, is being radical. It's like, no, we're trying to get back to the way this country actually works. So one of the pieces of language I like on that is to rebalance the court. And that, that's really truly what people want to do. The idea of preserving, for example, the laws under which we have lived for 100 years, that's not radical at all. That's actually really quite conservative. The idea of protecting the laws under which we have lived rather than completely tearing them up is conservative, not radical. The current majority of the court is, in fact, radical. So people have asked how we got here and have asked about what the Federalist Society is. And I wanted to focus on that a little bit, simply because a lot of people don't know what the Federalist Society is, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute. But what's interesting to me about the Federalist Society in a macro picture, along with the attacks on voting right now, also in a macro picture, is that the people who wanted to destroy the modern government had a real problem, because Americans like the modern government. I mean, that doesn't mean we like all the pieces of it by any stretch of the imagination, but we like regulation of business. We like clean air. We like clean water. We like to be able to turn on our taps and drink the water, which, by the way, has been under attack now for at least 40 years. Talk to people not only in Flint, Michigan, but in many places around the country. We like those things. We feel like we deserve those things. We like protection of civil rights, not only for our own civil rights, but also for those of our neighbors. We like infrastructure. We like being able to drive down the road and not hit potholes that pop our tires. We like, trains. We like telephone lines. We like broadband. We like those things. And we like a basic social safety net, because we don't think kids should starve in the streets, and we don't think, grandmothers should eat out of trash cans, which I've said to you before is one of the impetuses for the Social Security Act. There was a number of things that fed into it, and one of them was one of the thinkers that was behind it, not Francis Perkins, but one of the thinkers behind it, literally woke up one morning. He was a doctor in California, and he woke up and looked out of his window one morning, and there were two elderly women eating out of a trash can. And he was like, what's going on here? This is not okay. So we actually like that modern state. We actually like those things. We like a powerful country. We like to be able to do those things. So the problem for those who wanted to dismantle it was voting, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it was also that every time they thought they had one of their own people going on the court, like, for example, Harry Blackmun on the Supreme Court, he could sound like he was going to be a right-wing reactionary, and then he would get on the court and he would listen to people and he would listen to their stories, and he'd change his mind. And he'd recognize that this was actually, the idea of protecting civil rights, for example, was a good thing, not a bad thing. And Harry Blackmun is the one I picked out because he, in the end, Republican appointee by Richard Nixon, writes the Roe versus Wade decision. That's written by a Republican, not by a Democrat. And it's written in an era, of course, when both Republicans and Democrats believed in that kind of a government. So if you're trying to dismantle that, you got yourself a problem, because you keep putting your people, or people you think are your people, on the court. And then they end up changing their minds and going along with all this stuff you don't like. So what they did is, in 1982, a group of students from Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, and the University of Chicago Law School got together and created this concept of a Federalist Society. And they became a group that insisted on the concept of originalism. And I've talked before about originalism. Originalism had four branches originally, and once it came up in the 1970s, but really took off in the 1980s. And their concept, and it's a concept that only works if you squint real hard and don't put on your glasses. The concept is to go back to the original Constitution and to do only what is in that Constitution. And what that would achieve is, it would mean that everything that the court had done since the 1930s was unconstitutional. And they call those judges who did those things people who legislate from the bench. That is, by saying, no, in a state you can't discriminate against Jews, or you can't discriminate against Black people or women. That's legislation. The voters in those states said, hey, we're cool with these laws. But the courts came in and said, no, you can't do that, because the 14th Amendment says that all U.S. citizens have certain protections. So they said that is wrong, and in fact, we need to go back before that. But immediately, it became very clear their version of originalism was whatever they wanted. And they have always cherry-picked what was in those. Historians have always had their hair on fire, basically, because they invented things or didn't see things from that earlier period in order to get the ends they wanted. So, for example, when Samuel Alito, who's sort of known as the father on the court of originalism, decided the Heller decision, which is the one that discovered in the Constitution an individual right to bear arms, the historians of that period and of gun ownership were like, that is absolutely not what the Second Amendment was designed to do. The Second Amendment, as the rest of the Bill of Rights was designed to do, was to limit the power of the state, not to give individual rights. And it sounds like it's a weird distinction or an unimportant distinction, but it's actually quite a big distinction. What the Bill of Rights does is it says these are things the state can't do to you, but it doesn't say that you can then go ahead and grab from that certain rights. So that was a great example. But then we saw it more recently, of course, in the New York State decision from the court, and from the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision, where they say that the Constitution never talked about the right of abortion. Well, any scholar of women's history will tell you that there are a number of reasons for that, but that abortion was simply accepted in a thorough way until at least the middle of the 19th century, and in most states until the late 19th century. And so that, they found something in the Constitution that absolutely wasn't there. So the originalists that's what theoretically the Federalists are supposed to be, but they're a closed circle because, again, they're ideological. They're not impacted by reality, because that's the whole point. If you get impacted by reality, you have to sit there and say, oh, wait, there's a gray area here. Oh, wait, maybe we don't want to have the state involved here. Oh, wait, maybe we do want to have the state involved here. And so they have basically created this cell of jurists to put on the court. And as a result, they are extremist and they're ideologically driven. I've mentioned before that I believe this is the first Supreme Court in history that does not have anybody who's held elected office on it. I believe Sandra Day O'Connor was the last justice to hold an elected office. And recently, Justice Thomas said, whatever we decide is right, because I think his concept was north is still north. So we don't care what everybody thinks because we know what's right. And of course, those 6 people that are currently in the majority, a supermajority, if you will, are religiously driven. And this is one of the points that people are making now with their decisions, is that they are internally inconsistent unless you factor in Christianity. They are fervent Christians who are trying to trying to impose Christianity on the country. So that's what the Federalist Society is. And now those 6 people who currently make up the supermajority on the court are all members of the Federalist Society, and that's who they are. And of course, they're backed by huge money. This is Sheldon Whitehouse's big thing, senator from Rhode Island. He's always talking about the dark money that has put these people in place. As you know, Brett Kavanaugh was pushed onto court. I could just go on. Now that, and Coney Barrett as well, I could go on, but you don't really need me to. Now, people have asked me about, can't they be impeached for lying? Sure, they can be impeached for anything you want. They're not going to be convicted because it requires the votes of certain Republicans in the Senate, and there's no freaking way they're going to do that. So yes, Supreme Court justices can be impeached, and it does not mean they have to break a law. Impeachment is a political thing that says, I don't trust you anymore. My big example of that is that you could be an elected official and simply play video games all day. It's not illegal to play video games, but it would be within someone's right to say, don't really think you belong on the court, or I don't really think you belong in the White House if all you're going to do is play Super Mario. But then again, it also requires votes, and those votes are not simply there. So one of the things that people are talking about now is expanding the Supreme Court. Now I want to make some parameters around that. The current number of the Supreme Court is fixed at 9. There's nothing in the Constitution that fixes the number of Supreme Court justices, and we've had all sorts of them. And a reminder here, McConnell actually changed the number of courts himself under Obama when he limited it to 8. Stopped the process of putting 9 on, and was not really as called out for that as he should have been. Originally, when that number was established in 1869, it was done because there were 9 court districts. Now we have 13. So there's a push to expand the court to 13. I am in favor of doing that simply because we're a big country, we need more justices. But I'm also against doing it in this particular moment, because I don't know if I'm against it. Here's a caveat. I'm not, you should do whatever you want, and I'm giving you all the facts, and I'm not just saying you should go think whatever you think, because you're right. I actually don't feel like I'm the final word here. I think that the whole point of the moment in which we're in is that we need a lot of new ideas and a lot of new arguments. And I've changed my mind about a lot of stuff lately, because I tend to be kind of traditionalist, and there's a lot of stuff that I would have told you 10 years ago I would defend, and now I'm like, toss it out. Anyway, the problem with changing the number now is that it runs the risk of delegitimizing, not the court itself, which I think has already delegitimized itself. The number of Americans who actually trust the Supreme Court anymore is under 25%, which, those are not good polling numbers. But that it gives a political reason for those people who are already disaffected to say, we're throwing everything out. That being said, there are, to my mind, easier and more obvious ways to change what's going on with the court. And that is that if you look at the Constitution, you will see that the framers put very clear instructions for Congress, that's Article 1, very clear instructions for the executive branch, that's the second part of it. And then when they got to the Supreme Court or to the court system, they're like, go make courts. There's very little information about what is in that section or the way the court should be set up. The Constitution never established the right of judicial review. That was taken on by the court itself in 1803 with Marbury versus Madison. And I think that there would be few constitutional scholars who would say in this moment that we should turn over the entire government to one branch. I mean, that was the whole point of 3 branches, and the Supreme Court has really gone rogue. And there are movements afoot to limit what the Supreme Court can do, to limit the cases it can take on, to override its decisions, and perhaps to hem in the right of judicial review, which again they just took and was really not concentrated on much at all until the late 19th century. So there are plenty of ways for Congress, not for the president, although there are probably some things the president could do. So, for example, judges are appointed for until good behavior, which people have interpreted to mean until they're dead. There's no law that says they have to stay on a certain court. They could, in fact, be rotated through a different courts, through different federal courts, which would be one way to get people out of the Supreme Court. But the Congress has plenty of ways to hem that in. So that's really what I'm focusing on, is Congress taking back its power. Now, why is that so important to me? Because Congress represents us. And one of the things that we have really lost focus on is that we, the people, are increasingly, and I see this in your comments, are increasingly like, what are you going to do to me next? And the answer is, it's our Congress. Congress should answer to us, not to big money, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but to us. And that's one of the places to put pressure right now, is on your Congress critters, and to say, do something. I elected you to do something about the Supreme Court. Check it, stand up and say something, do something, at least introduce laws to trim it back. And people have asked about FDR, and when FDR went to increase the number of justices in order to stop them from continuing to destroy the New Deal, he didn't manage to do that, but he did make Supreme Court justices recognize that they'd better get with the program. And after he did that, they started to support the New Deal rather than turning against it. So even just putting pressure on the Supreme Court would be a good thing. Now let me hit another question having to do with the courts that is not really about the Supreme Court. You have all asked me about what the heck is going on with, where is it? With an apparent deal between the Biden administration and Mitch McConnell over the appointment of a pro-life judge, in Missouri. And let me say two things about that. Unfortunately, I can't find where that comment is. First of all, the White House is not commenting. And that is one of the things that it's really always important to remember in politics, is lots of people say stuff for political advantage. And the White House doesn't have a position, is not saying anything yet. And I will say, if in fact he made the deal as it is being presented, and again, we don't have a deal yet. We have rumors of it. We have reports of it. But we don't know what it entailed. And I will say, what's on the table right now, according to that deal, looks to me like Biden made a crappy deal, which is not his MO. He is actually an extraordinarily good deal maker. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I'm an agnostic on that yet. I think there's a lot of moving pieces having to do with our justice system, and that's one of those moving pieces. But I think it's a real mistake, at least for me anyway, to pull that one out and believe that it looks exactly like it looks. Maybe it does, and maybe he freaking slipped and did a really, really stupid thing. But he doesn't tend to do stupid things. He tends to speak stupidly when he speaks off the cuff. He actually gives great speeches, by the way. People forget he's a good speech maker. When he speaks off the cuff, he makes gaffes, but he is a very good deal maker. So, like I say, I can't give you much more than that right now, except to remember that right now, there's a lot of problems with the court. And the problems are there not just for people who object to what the court is doing. The problems are also there for people who want Americans to trust the court. That court has gone rogue. So there's interest in a lot of places to try and rein it in a little bit. So the fact that we've got this rumor out there about what Biden has done, maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. But there's an awful lot of pieces moving that I suspect a lot of us don't see. And we'll see. And and again, I can understand. My hair was on fire when I read it. That's the third time I've said that this broadcast. Um, but whenever somebody won't confirm something in politics, I always assume there's a lot more out there, and it's worth looking at the around the edges. So sometimes, for example, you will hear something about some country doing something, and you kind of listen around the edges and you realize other things are going on as well. And that's kind of how I feel about that. Somebody asked about was America founded to have freedom of religion? That was not the driving force behind the organization of the United States of America, but it is 100% protected in our Constitution. That was the point of the First Amendment, and it was reiterated a number of times, not least in the Treaty of Tripoli, which I actually happened today to have open in front of me on my computer. Not for this, for something else. And I just want to point out that when John Adams signed the Treaty of Tripoli, it had in it this line in Article 11, and it says, in this treaty, which is signed in 1799, I believe, nope, 1796, immediately, the very beginning, all the guys are still alive, except probably Button Gwinnett, who had something to do with the founding. He said, as the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the states never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Muslim nation, and it's declared that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. So they put it really in there with the Treaty of Tripoli of 1796, saying the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Now, I want to say a little bit more about that because I think it's really interesting. One of the reasons for that, now there's a whole colonial history of religion and its importance or not having to do with the colonies, but one of the really interesting pieces of the First Amendment and of Madison's role in it is Madison is very clear. He's concerned about the government trying to intervene in what he calls the right of conscience. The government stepping in to say, you can't think this way, or if you are, I forget the sects he was concerned about. There were some Protestant sects who were in trouble in Virginia and they had to pay fines. And he didn't want the government to be able to do that because he said that a man's right of conscience, he's more concerned about man than anybody else, right of conscience was an unalienable right. So in the Declaration of Independence, I talk about this a lot, that there are we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they have these unalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's not the limit of them. That's some of them, and they also have the right to choose their governments. But Madison later on wanted to add to unalienable rights, which means you can't get rid of them, the right of conscience. So the idea of America not being a nation founded on a religious background or a religious base, the way today's Christo-fascists would argue, is absolutely part of our history. And somebody asked for more facts on that. I actually wrote a letter about that, and James Madison probably a year or more ago, and you can search. My Facebook page is searchable, and just search. Not just search Madison, actually. I don't write about Madison all that much, and it will come up. All right, so what next? Let me do a couple more quick questions. Why on earth hasn't the ERA been put into the Constitution? And I've answered this before. Let me just answer it again. When the ERA was being in the process of being ratified, a number of the states had, or maybe the ratification process itself had a time limit. A number of the ratifications did not make it through that time, through in time to meet that time limit. And since then, a number of states have rescinded their ratification of the ERA. that again is not to say that anybody needs to be bound by that. It seems to me high time to reintroduce that and to start again. Um, so that doesn't mean it's over and dead in the water, but simply that perhaps a legal fight over that right now would be less effective than simply going back to some of the states who rescinded it, for example, and said, "Hey, how would you like to talk about that again? Because you're not going to get my vote otherwise." So that's why the ERA is not has not been added to the Constitution. I know a lot of people out there say, "Oh, it's just a question of taking it to the archivist, and the archivist can put it into the Constitution," and that's actually not right. It's being challenged in court because of the time limit that ran out, and because of the fact a number of states have rescinded their ratification of it. And the Brennan Center has some very good articles about how that's playing out if anybody else is interested. I'm sure I just infuriated somebody. I'm sorry, I'm not making the rules here. I'm just reporting them. All right. Somebody asked about whether or not our Constitution was made, as John Adams said, only for a moral and religious people. And the answer to that is John Adams might have said that. John Adams pontificated a lot. He was often known as your rotundity, and he kind of poked fun at himself a lot in his late years because he and Thomas Jefferson were so busy making themselves into gods. But there's a lot of things going on when you talk about people in the early republics calling themselves virtuous and religious. That is part of their political vision, and it distinguishes them from those they consider to be corrupt and only out for themselves. That's actually not important to the functioning of the government, and people like Alexander Hamilton recognized that the way that you got the system to work was to take advantage of people's self-interest. So you probably hear me talk a lot about, there's what's right in politics, and there's what's morally right, and I actually believe that things can be morally right. But you can't make a political argument based on moral rightness and succeed. I mean, there's people vote for their interest. So one of the things that really makes an argument take off is to say, you might not care, for example, about human enslavement in 1858, as Abraham Lincoln talked to an audience about all white voters, right? And he gets them to vote to stop the spread of enslavement. Not by saying it's morally wrong to enslave your black neighbors, although it was morally wrong to enslave their black neighbors, and Lincoln believed it was morally wrong, but by saying that's hurting you. And this is why this system of enslavement spreading westward is hurting you, poor white guy. And he got them on board by appealing to their self-interest. And so our system, for all that people talk about morality, including me, the way our system works is by appealing to people's self-interest and making sure that, with the idea that that self-interest will cancel each other out and will actually move the country in a good direction. And I can't give you more on that now. There's books written on that, and they're really interesting. But I only have 15 minutes left. If you want to bring it up again, let me know. More questions then. About before I actually get into more questions about the political process, I do want to mention briefly yesterday's shooting, which was important not only because of the lives lost, and not just the dead, but the traumatized and the wounded, but because it was an attack on our public space, our public civic space, in a way that is important, because the whole point of 4th of July parades and 4th of July picnics and all that is for us to celebrate our civic identity as Americans. And that in many ways echoes attacks on public schools, where again, theoretically, we're all just learning stuff together, and the attack on the concert goers in Las Vegas a number of years ago, because in many ways concerts are secular civic spaces, and I don't mean religiously. I mean they're places where you come together regardless of your political beliefs and share enthusiasm for one artist or recording artist or another. And yesterday's attack on that public space is very important. The continuing attacks on public spaces, because again, what the point of this radical white supremacists are determined to divide us into separate spheres where we can't be in the same place with each other because it's dangerous, because of whatever, and we get into our little silos, and that will further divide us. And that's so that's one of the reasons that yesterday's shooting was horrific, not only because of the obvious and because of the attack um, on a Fourth of July parade, but also because of the attack on our public spaces. And it's really important, I think, for us to focus on public spaces going forward. And I don't just mean the public schools, although obviously I care deeply about those, but places where people come together. Churches, parades, all the concerts. Concerts are big, actually. Places where people of different political bases come together and recognize they have a lot of stuff in common. Labor unions, uh, I said churches, fraternal organizations, sororal organizations, all those sorts of places. So I wanted to mention that as well. All right, so another question here. Now we're getting into politics. So somebody asked if Trump is going to announce he's running again, how does that get him off the hook from being charged and prosecuted, as The Guardian said recently? Well, what they're talking about is the fact that the Department of Justice supposed to try not to get involved in politics. So they tend not to go after political figures immediately before an election, a rule that James Comey broke, of course, when he went after Hillary Clinton's emails while voting was already underway. And that itself is an issue that has never really been pursued, why he did that. And there have been a lot of hints about the fact he was under pressure from somebody, but they've never really been explored that I've seen anyway, and I would love to know more about that. So the implication is that the Department of Justice would stand back and try not to get involved with that. If that's the case and they would really do that, then I think we've got bigger problems with the Department of Justice, because we're not talking about going after somebody for, misfiling a $50 donation. We're talking about somebody who tried to destroy our democracy. So that's what they're talking about, but that's not something that I am currently losing sleep over. As you know, probably today, a grand jury in Georgia issued subpoenas to a number of people, including South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, about to give testimony about the attempt to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia. And there's a lot of stuff going on in a lot of places. It's going on slowly, more slowly than people would like, certainly more slowly than I would like. But it is going on. And even if the Department of Justice looks the other way, other places are not. So, for example, there is the Georgia investigation in which Trump is on tape trying to cheat in an election. But there is also the fact that you probably or may not recall this, but the whole beginning of Trump's social media company involved investors in a it's a fairly complicated way that you invest money in a investment company, and they go ahead and find somebody to put someplace to put that money in, and now that's being looked at by the Southern District of New York, I believe, because it appears that it was potentially illegal. There's a lot, and that's a lot of money. That's billions. I mean, that's at least $1 billion. So there's a lot of places where even if the Department of Justice drops the ball, which again, I don't think it's going to do over this, other people are still involved. All right, so that's what's going on with that. Somebody asked, are the Democrats running candidates that are far right? Why are they doing this? They did not run a candidate to challenge a Republican in Utah. They backed an independent candidate, Evan McMullin, who used to be a Republican, certainly not a Democrat. But the argument behind doing that is actually quite smart. It comes from, I'm not saying it comes from, scholars like Daniel Ziblatt, who wrote How Democracies Die, point out that the way you hamstring a rising fascist state is for people who oppose that fascist state to stop splintering their vote and to come together. And realistically, a Democrat was not going to get elected in this election cycle in Utah, so the Democrats said, okay, we're going to throw our weight behind anybody who can take down a Republican, and that's Evan McMullin. So that's what's happening there, and I assume elsewhere. All right, so what else did I want to talk about? So let me go here. I'm going to jump forward here. Somebody asked if there is a relationship between organized crime and autocracies, and the answer to that is quite clearly yes. Because one of the things that none of us are really talking about as much as we ought to is to what end? You know, to what end are we destroying the right to vote? Are we destroying civil rights? Are we destroying government regulation? To what end is that going on? Well, for Christo-fascists, what's going on is they want to impose their religious beliefs on everybody else. But as this old friend of mine said, she was born in the 19th century, and she always said this. She always used to say to me, "Follow the money, Heather. Who's getting the money?" Well, in this world where where we destroy civil rights and we destroy business regulation and we get rid of a basic social safety net and we get rid of infrastructure development, where do you think the money's going to go? And you know, if you don't know the answer to that, all you have to do is look at Hungary under Viktor Orban. And I keep pointing that out because that was a democracy that has is sliding toward authoritarianism. And he simply used the law to chase out of their businesses his opponents and to hand them over to his cronies. Similarly, of course, Putin has the oligarchs who surround him as well. And they're the money in Russia has all moved up into those oligarchies, who then in turn exercise power and authority over the people who live around them. So that structure is very similar, and that's something that I wish we were paying more attention to in America, is the rise of our wealth up to a very small group of people. And one of the things that really jumps out when you think about that is who calls the shots. So, for example, I'm writing right now about the American Revolution, and one of the things that really infuriated the colonists was that the Parliament just taxed them. And you've always heard that, taxation without representation. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean, and why were people upset about that? Well, one of the interpretations of that is they're mad because they don't want to pay any money. Well, that's probably true. But what it means is that the state can arbitrarily affect your life without you having a say in it. And the fact that we are currently in a place where, for example, our Congress can't raise taxes because of the opposition of the Republicans in the Senate, what does that say about who holds the power? Is it still the American people who hold the power when, in fact, the vast majority of us would like to see higher taxes on corporations and on the very wealthiest Americans? That's a real issue in terms of who has power. So one of the things, again, that when you think of organized crime, they are organized criminals because they want to make money. I mean, it's easier to break the rules and to gather everything into your own hands if there isn't a government with teeth guaranteeing that you go to jail if you do that, or regulating how you do business so that you can't go ahead and do that. So that you can't go ahead, for example, and use the government to chase your rivals out of their steel industry and give it to your friends, that there's actually a level playing field. And that's really important. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. All right, so the next question here is that has there, I didn't get to dark money, but all right. Has there been an example of deprogramming a significant portion of the country? How do you get people to leave the political cult in which they appear to be living? And the answer to that is we have had opportunities to do that in America before, and they have not always been successful. So one of the things that should have happened after the Civil War is that we should have prosecuted the people who were the ringleaders in that war. And the reason for that is really clear, and you see that from the work of people like Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Sarah Kendzior and Daniel Ziblatt and in fact Hannah Arendt and all the people who look at fascism and authoritarianism. And they say the way you break the back of a cult like that is you prosecute, not by creating new laws that are vindictive the way East Germany did against Nazis after World War II, but that insists that they are held accountable to the law. And one of the things that has me very concerned is the degree to which we are not holding to account not the big people who the Department of Justice is going after. I believe at this point they have indicted, I think it's 850 people, although I may be wrong on that number, don't quote me. But they're clearly moving up the ladder. But the degree to which local governments are not holding to account the people who are disrupting school boards, for example, or who are threatening local politicians. Because as long as you permit that to happen, those people become emboldened and the good people leave the public sphere. Similarly, I think we need to do something about gun rights, not only because they've gone so far out of whack, but also because what that does is it drives people out of public spaces. So holding people to account is enormously important. There's another thing that's important too, and you can see Biden hitting on this again and again, and that is recreating a fair economy. Because the reason that that an authoritarian is able to get the support of the kind of people that are currently supporting Trump is because they have been dispossessed either economically or culturally or religiously, and they sit there and they say, wait a minute, I can't afford this anymore, and my job has been taken by X. And that's one of the classic ways that you destabilize a society in order to create a strong man, is to destabilize the economy and to move all the money upward. Well, look what's happening. That's exactly what's going on right now. So you see this with Biden constantly trying to say, I'm trying to make the economy fairer. And one of the reasons that the Republicans keep hitting on inflation and what's going on with inflation. And yet, if you look at inflation, of course, it's big around the world. But what's really happening is a change in the way we do business. More people are ordering things online, but also price gouging. And we just don't have laws against price gouging to the extent that it's going on. So, for example, it is 12 times more expensive because of shipping costs, which have just gone through the roof, to get something from China than it was 2 years ago. Not 12%, 12 times. And there is, I am no longer able to think that that is just a reflection of market forces when you also look at the fact that corporations are posting their highest profits in history. And that, again, speaks to who is holding the power right now in our society. So one of the ways you stop this from happening is to try and make the economy fairer, which is what Biden is doing. And if you look at any of our most, our periods in American history when people are most racially and gender tolerant and accepting, is times when the economy is good. So there is that. And there is finally something I always care a lot about: language. As long as people let the authoritarians control the language, people want to be part of that. You don't want to be part of the losing team. You want to be part of the winning team. And one of the things that I urge people to do is to take back our public conversation and say, I don't want to live in a world where I can get shot, my kid can get shot at a school or at a parade. I want to live in a world where we can share spaces together, and I want my kids to get education, and I want a fair wage. I want you to have a fair wage. And part of the moment in which we're in is going to be reclaiming that public language and reclaiming that public space. Now, people have asked, is this a moment for the rise of a third party? It is the time for the rise of a new political language. I think the Republican Party is not easy to dismantle. In the past, I've thought it wasn't easy to dismantle because the state parties had such power over their voter lists and all that. The Republican Party has now moved itself into radical Christofascism. In its place, if anybody wants to reclaim the principles of the original Republican Party, I will write your speeches. I know how to do it. I know the history of that party. That's not to say I'm necessarily identifying myself with that, but that, as you know, I have said, we need that party and those principles, as well as the principles of the Democratic Party going forward. Is this the time? It absolutely could be. People have asked about whether or not Biden is going to run in 2024. Who cares? That's like 2.5 years away. And lots is going to happen between that. Not just could, but is going to happen between now and then. So, and somebody else said, who else is out there? I will tell you right now, I think that Gavin Newsom is working really hard to be out in front right now, and he's doing a lot of really smart things. That's not to say I'm supporting him, but when people say there's no one there, The fact that he is advertising on Fox News and taking the fight to the Republicans is playing really well among a lot of Democrats. Jamie Raskin is out there. I don't know if he wants national attention. Kristen Whitmer. There's a lot of people who are there waiting to move forward. You do not want to come forward too early because you write your campaign the wrong way. So don't lose sleep over whether or not you're going to support Biden. That is so far from now in politics, it might as well be the next generation. So I'm not worried about that at all. How concerned am I about a constitutional convention orchestrated by the right? Extremely. I think we should work within our Constitution, which they have perverted to make us think we need a new one. We don't. We just need to get back to the original meaning of our Constitution and to fix it in the places it needs to be fixed. When people talk about 1776, as you asked, what they are doing is trying to say our government doesn't work and we need to throw it out and turn it into this Christian nation that people like Lauren Boebert believe we should be. I'm dead set against that. I really do believe that what this moment calls for is for people who care about this country to reclaim it. And people say, oh, there's so much going on. And on that, I'm on very firm ground. This whole religious thing is definitely new in terms of the power that they have gotten. They've certainly made that call in the 1890s. People forget they tried to amend the Constitution to make it a Christian nation in the 1880s and the 1890s and failed, but they've never actually had this much power through the Supreme Court. But we certainly have been in a moment before where our Constitution has been perverted to turn the entire country over to a very few people who wanted to run it for their own profit and for their own power. And that was the 1850s. And the way that people like Abraham Lincoln took it back was simply by saying, that's not what the Declaration of Independence said. The Declaration of Independence says we're all created equal. We have the right to a say in our government, and our laws should treat us all equally, which is what the Constitution says. And to the degree the Constitution did not include people of color and women in its original incarnation, Americans fixed that in 1868 with the 14th Amendment that said that no state could deprive an American citizen of the due process of the law. So we've been here before, and the way that Lincoln and people like him reclaimed the country in those days was by demanding of their representatives that they obeyed the law and that they made sure other people obeyed the law. And they organized. They talked to people. They talked to their friends and said, I'm concerned about this. And any political scientist will tell you that you will change more minds by talking to your friends than by writing a million postcards, because people listen to their friends. They want to be part of a tribe. And speaking up and taking back our public space, both by writing to the media and saying, for example, to the New York Times, stop using misleading language, and to tell your local newspapers, and if there aren't local newspapers, to start going to meetings yourself and reporting on what happens at those meetings on Facebook or on Substack or just to your friends, is going to help change that public conversation before the 2022 elections, because this one really matters. All right, I have gone over. I'm sorry, that was a little bit disjointed. But I know everyone's tired and stressed, frightened, and now is the time not to splinter and think, oh, I got to worry about this, I got to worry about this, I got to worry about this, but to say, what do I want? Not what does Ted Cruz want? What do I want? And how do I get that? How do I make my voice heard? And stop trying to react to what other people are saying and start to act on what you want and what your friends want and how you want to reclaim this country. Because it worked pretty well until the last 40 years. Not for everybody, I know, and it was never perfect. That's the whole point. We always get to work on it. But we don't have to live in the world that the modern day Republican Party has consigned us to. And I don't want to live in this world. I want to change it into something better than it's ever been. Thank you for being here. And I will, I don't know when I'll be back. I'll let you know. Thanks for being here.